Every once in a while, I still see her. Same time almost every morning. Same little dog, same rigid posture. She walks past my house as if it's invisible. Eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw clenched, acting like I'm no more than another mailbox lining the street. No wave, no glance, nothing at all. And honestly, that's the most satisfying part of this entire story. Because about 6 months ago, this woman, let's call her Janet Crowley, was completely convinced she could carve off a piece of my property, stick a sign in the ground, and declare a community space just because she decided it was. And she nearly pulled it off. Let me rewind a bit. My wife and I bought our home roughly 3 years ago in what real estate agents love to describe as a quiet, family-friendly suburban neighborhood. You know the kind. Around 40 homes, all built in the same era. Similar floor plans, but tweaked just enough that it doesn't feel like a carbon copy maze. What really sold us wasn't the house itself. It was the lot. We specifically chose what the realtor called an edge lot, which is just a polite way of saying we had a little extra room to breathe. When the original developer mapped out the neighborhood, our property ended up with this strange paved extension near the street. It wasn't exactly a driveway and not quite a sidewalk either, more like a small concrete apron that blended right into the curb. To anyone passing by, it looked like public parking, but it wasn't. We knew that because during escrow we paid for a full land survey, stakes hammered into ground, precise measurements, detailed maps, the whole process. That paved section was ours. Every single inch of it, deed backed and survey confirmed. No gray area at all. Apparently, the previous owners had been pretty relaxed about it. During block parties or holidays, they let guests park there. Casual, neighborly stuff. No big deal. And honestly, when we first moved in, we didn't use it much either. Sometimes my wife would pull in to unload groceries. Occasionally friends would park there when they came over. Most days, it just sat empty. That detail becomes very important later. Now, when we first moved in, the HOA was fine, almost invisible, which is exactly how an HOA should be. The dues were reasonable. The common areas were clean. Nobody was measuring lawns with a ruler. The president back then was an older guy named Frank. He'd held the position forever, and it showed. He understood the unspoken rule of HOAs. Nobody actually wants you around. You're there to keep things running and stay out of the spotlight. Then Frank retired and moved to Arizona. Entered Janet Crowley. Janet didn't simply become HOA president. She rose to the role. She treated it like she'd just been elected mayor of a small city. Monthly emails doubled, then tripled. Suddenly, there were new rules about trash compliance. Porch lights couldn't be out longer than 48 hours. Courtesy notices started appearing for things no one had ever cared about before. And then there were the meetings. What used to be quick, low-key check-ins turned into long, uncomfortable lectures about community standards and protecting property values. Janet would stand at the front with a clipboard, wearing that tight smile people get when they're enjoying authority just a little too much. About 8 months ago, she unveiled her big idea, the Neighborhood Beautification Initiative. On paper, it sounded harmless enough. New flower beds, decorative landscaping, a refreshed look. Who wouldn't want that? Here was the problem. To make room for her vision, the HOA approved the removal of 12 street parking spots across the development. 12. In a neighborhood of roughly 40 homes that was already tight on parking. Overnight, everything changed. People started competing for spots. Cars crept onto lawns. Guests double parked. Weekends turned into chaos. Every get-together became a negotiation over where people could leave their cars. I noticed it, but it didn't really affect us. We used our driveway. That paved area stayed mostly empty. Then one Tuesday evening, I turned onto our street and saw something that made my stomach sink. Bright white signs with blue lettering, professionally installed. Guest parking only, 2-hour limit. They were mounted on metal posts, sunk straight into the ground on my property. Not near it, not close to it, on it. At first, I honestly assumed it had to be a mistake. Maybe the city had done something strange. Maybe a contractor messed up the boundary lines. I took photos, walked the perimeter, and pulled out our survey documents at home. There was no question those signs were at least 3 feet onto our land. So I did what seemed reasonable. I brought it up at the next HOA meeting. Thursday night, community center, folding chairs, about half the neighborhood present. When Janet asked if there was any new business, I stood up, phone and paperwork in hand, and said calmly, I think there might be an error. Guest parking signs were installed on my property this week. I expected surprise, maybe an apology, a simple, oh, we'll look into that. Instead, she barely looked up. Oh, that's part of the parking solution we discussed last month, she said, as if she were explaining something obvious. With the beautification project, we needed overflow areas. That space wasn't being used anyway. I remember blinking, trying to process what she just said. I'm sorry, I replied, but that's actually my property. I have the survey right here. That's when she finally looked at me and her tone shifted. That slow, patient voice people use when they think you're being unreasonable. This is about the greater good of the community, she said. We can't afford to be nitpicky when everyone else is struggling with parking. A few people nodded along. That's when it hit me. They weren't confused. They were desperate. And my unused space looked like the perfect solution. I tried once more. It's literally on my deed. She smiled, scribbled something on her notepad, and said, We'll take that under advisement. Any other new business? And just like that, the discussion ended. I sat through the rest of the meeting in stunned silence, realizing something important had changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. Afterward, a few neighbors apologized. They told me how bad the parking situation had become. One guy mentioned his elderly parents had stopped visiting because they couldn't park close enough. I felt for them. I really did. I genuinely felt bad for them. But none of that changed one simple, unavoidable fact. They were using my land. And over the next week, they didn't just use it. They started treating it like it belonged to them. Cars showed up there every single day. When I tried to say something, strangers got defensive. One woman looked me straight in the eye and said, The HOA newsletter says this is overflow parking. That's when I went back inside, pulled out the newsletters, and read them carefully. Sure enough, buried near the back was a casual little line advertising my property as community parking. That was the exact moment I realized politeness wasn't going to fix this. Because once an HOA convinces itself it's acting in the name of the community, individual property rights stop mattering. And that's when things stopped being annoying and started becoming serious. All right, pause the story right here, because this is the part where I need to step out of the moment for a second and explain what was really happening behind the scenes. Not emotionally, not dramatically, structurally. By standard procedure, an HOA has exactly zero authority over privately deeded property unless the homeowner explicitly grants an easement or the governing documents clearly say otherwise. And no, it looks and use is not a legal category. Neither is for the greater good. From a legal standpoint, what Janet and the board did wasn't just rude, it was reckless. By installing signs on land they didn't own and then publicly advertising that land as community parking, the HOA crossed a line from overreach into misrepresentation. That's the point where liabilities start stacking up fast. Now add the psychological layer, because this part matters. This is a trap that shows up all the time in small power systems like HOAs. When someone gains authority in a low-stakes environment, they often inflate the importance of their role to justify control. Janet didn't see herself as a volunteer anymore. She saw herself as a problem solver, a stabilizer, maybe even a savior of property values. And once she publicly framed the parking crisis as solved, backing down would have meant admitting she made a mistake. That's where ego locks people into bad decisions. At that point, ignoring one homeowner feels easier than unraveling the story she sold to the entire neighborhood. And the neighbors played their part too. Scarcity changes morals. When parking disappeared, people stopped asking whether something was right and started asking whether it was available. If the HOA said it was allowed, that was good enough. The lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. HOAs usually don't become dangerous because they're evil. They become dangerous because nobody stops them early, and everyone benefits just enough to stay quiet. And that silence is exactly what set the stage for what happened next. Once you realize you're not dealing with a misunderstanding anymore, something shifts inside you. That's exactly where I was. Up until then, I'd been patient. I'd been polite. I'd followed the reasonable homeowner playbook. Meetings, documents, certified letters, all of it. And what did it get me? More cars on my land, more entitlement, and eventually a violation notice. Yep, 2 weeks after I sent my certified letter, the one with the survey attached, the photos, and a clear request to remove the signs, I found a courtesy violation taped to my door. The charges, unsightly landscaping and debris. The debris? My car, parked on my own property. I read it 3 times just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. According to the HOA, by parking my car where they had designated guest parking, I was interfering with community use and negatively impacting property values. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. That's when it clicked. They weren't going to stop. They were going to escalate until I folded. So I stopped reacting and started preparing. The first call I made was to a local towing company. The owner had this gravelly voice and sounded like he'd been doing the job since before cell phones existed. I explained the situation, my land, unauthorized signs, daily parking. He didn't sound surprised at all. Happens more than you'd think, he said. HOAs get a little power and forget where the lines are. We set up a standing authorization agreement. Simple deal. Any unauthorized vehicle on my property gets towed. I don't pay a dime. The vehicle owner covers everything. Next step was signage. Not HOA signs. Legal signs. Small, compliant notices that read, private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed. Nothing flashy. Just enough to satisfy the law. I installed them around the perimeter of the disputed area. Then came the camera. High definition, motion activated, night vision. I tucked it into what looked like a decorative birdhouse, so it didn't scream surveillance. I wanted clean footage, not confrontation. At that point, everything was ready. All I needed was opportunity. And the HOA handed it to me on a silver platter. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood newsletter announced the annual summer community celebration. Potluck, music, kids' activities, big event. And right there in bold text, parking will be limited. Residents are encouraged to utilize all designated guest overflow areas throughout the neighborhood. I knew exactly what that meant. Saturday evening, early August. I spent the morning double-checking everything. Camera angles perfect. Tow company on standby. Documents organized. By 6:30 p.m., my property was full. 12 cars. Sedans, SUVs. And one massive white luxury vehicle parked right next to one of the HOA guest parking signs. Janet's car. I didn't act immediately. I waited. Let everyone settle in. Let the event hit full swing. Let people get comfortable. Around 8 p.m., I made the call. Hey, it's me. I've got about 12 unauthorized vehicles on my property. There was a pause on the line. 12, he said, impressed. All right, we'll send 3 trucks. My wife and I sat on the porch with lemonade, watching the street like we were waiting for fireworks. The first truck rolled in at 8:15. Then 2 more. These guys were professionals. No drama. No yelling. Just quiet, methodical efficiency. Hook, load, move, over and over again. Flatbeds, dollies, clean lifts. 45 minutes later, the space was empty, completely empty. Just a sign standing there, looking absolutely ridiculous. Then the shouting started. Someone must have gone back to grab something from their car, because within minutes, confused groups started wandering over. Phones out, voices raised, people spinning in circles like the cars had somehow teleported. Around 9:15, Janet arrived. She marched straight across my lawn like she owned it, which, in her mind, she probably still did. She stopped in front of me and demanded, "What did you do?" She shouted, "Where are the cars?" I took a slow sip of my lemonade. I had them towed. I said evenly, they were parked on private property without permission. Her face flushed red almost instantly. "You can't do that. People parked here in good faith. The HOA designated this as community parking. The HOA doesn't own my land." I replied, "And I told you that in writing." One of the other board members jumped in, trying to play peacemaker. "Look, this clearly got out of hand. Can't we work something out?" These people are going to have to pay hundreds of dollars. That's when I went inside. I came back out with a folder. Survey, certified letter, violation notices, tow company agreement. I laid everything out. This isn't a misunderstanding, I said. You ignored my request. You fined me for parking on my own property. You told the entire neighborhood this land was available when it wasn't. Janet snapped back. You're going to destroy community relationships over parking. No, I said. You did that when you decided convenience mattered more than property rights. That's when the real questions started coming from the crowd. Were the cars towed? How far away is it? How are we supposed to get there? It turned out a lot of people had carpooled. 15 miles away. Tow lot closed at midnight. Cash only. The celebration was effectively over. I watched Janet scramble, trying to organize rides, taking heat from neighbors who were suddenly realizing they trusted the wrong authority. We went inside around 10. The next morning, 3 new violation notices were taped to my door. Disrupting a community event, failure to act in good faith, behavior detrimental to neighborhood harmony. Total fines came out to about $800. I added them to the folder. Then I called a lawyer. Property law, boundary disputes. He reviewed everything and called me back a few hours later. This is one of the clearest cases I've ever seen, he said. They have no authority here. In fact, they've exposed themselves to liability. That's when things flipped. A demand letter went out. Legal language. Clear consequences. By Thursday, the HOA's attorney called. They wanted to resolve the issue, remove the signs, rescind the fines, and avoid escalation. I asked about damages, oil stains, lawn damage, legal consultation, camera and signage costs. About $1,500. There was a long pause. They agreed. 2 weeks later, the signs were gone. A small decorative fence went up marking the property line. A check arrived with a written apology acknowledging the HOA had acted without authority. And at the next HOA meeting, Janet resigned, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. Power evaporates quickly when consequences show up. After everything settled, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter, more careful. People still waved, still made small talk, but there was a new awareness underneath it. Like everyone had collectively realized something they'd never really thought about before. The HOA wasn't some abstract authority floating above them. It was just people. And people make mistakes. Big ones. Janet still lives here. I see her sometimes, walking that little dog, staring anywhere but at my house. I don't take joy in that part. Okay, maybe a little. But mostly it reminds me how fragile authority really is when it isn't anchored to actual rules. The lesson here isn't tow your neighbor's cars. If that's what someone hears, they miss the point entirely. The real lesson is that boundaries matter, especially in places where everyone pretends they don't. HOAs exist in the strange space between government and neighborhood club. They borrow the language of law, the posture of authority, and the moral cover of community good. Without constant pushback, they can drift into something else entirely. A group of volunteers making decisions they were never empowered to make. From a legal perspective, what protected me wasn't aggression or cleverness. It was documentation, surveys, certified letters, paper trails, the boring stuff people don't deal with until they have no choice. That's what shut this down. But there's also a psychological side that doesn't get talked about enough. When something becomes scarce, parking, space, resources, people stop thinking in terms of fairness and start thinking in terms of survival. If someone in power says, "Don't worry, I fixed it," most people don't ask how. They just feel relief and move on. That's how lines get crossed. What really stuck with me afterward was how many neighbors quietly told me they were glad someone finally pushed back. Not because they enjoyed the chaos, nobody did, but because it forced a reset. It reminded everyone that if the HOA could casually take my property, it could eventually take something from them too. That's why the board changed. That's why policies tightened. That's why legal reviews became mandatory. Not because they suddenly became more ethical, but because they became more aware of consequences. And that's the part people underestimate. Reason only works when both sides are willing to be reasonable. When one side decides your rights are optional, politeness turns into permission. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks petty. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes it disrupts the peace. But peace that depends on one person giving up their rights isn't peace. It's just quiet imbalance. If Janet had asked me early on genuinely, "Hey, can we talk about temporary parking solutions?" I probably would have worked something out. I'm not unreasonable. Most people aren't. But once the HOA decided they could take first, explain later, and punish me for objecting, it stopped being about parking and became about principle. And here's the thing that really stays with me. Most abuses of power don't start with bad intentions. They start when someone convinces themselves the rules don't apply this time, that the inconvenience is minor, that resistance is selfish. That's how small authority turns into big overreach. So if you live under an HOA, know this. Read your documents. Know your boundaries. Keep records. Don't assume a community decision automatically means a legal one. And if you've ever been in a situation where pushing back felt awkward or dramatic or like you'd be labeled that neighbor, ask yourself this. If nobody ever pushes back, how far does it go? That's the question I'll leave you with. Because the difference between community and control is usually just one unchecked decision.